He took everything from us, Izzy. Nate Cross stole our lives, and now I have to leave you with nothing." Those were the last coherent words my father, Victor Hale, ever spoke to me. He was lying in a sterile, bleach-smelling hospital room in the winter of 2019, coughing up blood. The lung cancer had hollowed him out, turning a man I used to view as a giant into a fragile, bitter skeleton. He gripped my hand with a desperate, bruising strength, transferring a lifetime of failure and anger directly into my veins. He looked at me with hollow eyes, begging me to carry his burden. And right there, at 23 years old, watching the only parent I had left slowly suffocate, I made a promise. I promised him I would make Nate Cross pay, that I didn't just make a promise that night. I forged my entire existence around it. Now, let me fast forward 5 years to the spring of 2024. I was no longer a grieving kid in a hospital room. I was 28 years old, standing in the penthouse office of the Cross Meridian Group in downtown Seattle, looking directly at the man who had ruined my family. Nate Cross was 61 years old, but he carried the heavy, intimidating presence of a much larger man. He was the founder and sole owner of a logistics and industrial transport empire that generated $2.1 billion a year. But you would never know it by looking at him. He didn't live like a billionaire. He didn't act like one. Nate was a notoriously cold, highly controlling man who trusted absolutely no one in the world. While other CEOs of his caliber were buying private jets and wearing custom Italian suits, Nate drove a 10-year-old sedan and wore cheap, smudged reading glasses. He lived a bizarrely simple life, hiding his massive wealth so effectively that if you bumped into him at a grocery store, you'd assume he was a retired math teacher. But inside that boardroom, he was an absolute predator. I had watched him dismantle rival companies and negotiate massive labor disputes without ever raising his voice. He controlled an operation of over 5,200 employees spread across 11 states. He knew the intricate details of every single moving part of his company. He demanded perfection, and he crushed anyone who tried to cross him. And he had absolutely no idea that the woman standing next to him, handing him his daily strategy briefings, was his executioner, that my real name is Isabella Hale. But inside that building, I was Isabella Vale. Izzy. I had changed my last name, fabricated a flawless professional background, and scrubbed my digital footprint clean. It had taken me months of obsessive preparation just to secure an entry-level interview at Cross Meridian, where absolutely no one knew my true identity. I knew exactly what they were looking for, and I played the part to perfection. The hungry, brilliant, emotionally detached corporate strategist who only cared about the bottom line. Over the last 18 months, my rise through the company was unprecedented. I climbed the corporate ladder faster than anyone in the history of Cross Meridian. By 28, I was sitting in the high-stakes role of Director of Strategy. I had security clearance to the deepest, most restricted levels of the company's servers. I had access to their private financial records, their weak points, their vulnerabilities. But most importantly, I had access to him. Nate didn't let people in. He was a reinforced wall of ice to his executives, immediately shutting down any small talk and demanding pure, ruthless efficiency. But for some inexplicable reason, he took a liking to me. Or rather, he recognized a matching ruthlessness in me. He started mentoring me. He brought me into highly classified, closed-door meetings. He asked for my input on multi-million-dollar acquisitions. Slowly but surely, he was grooming me to be his successor. Every single time he praised my work or trusted me with a new secret, I felt physically sick. I would smile, shake his hand, and then drive home to my apartment, open my encrypted laptop, and continue building the explosive device that would obliterate his life. The history between my father and Nate was a dark, unspoken secret. Back in 1992, they had co-founded a small manufacturing warehouse down in Portland. They were supposed to be equal partners. They were supposed to be brothers. They built that initial business together for 5 grueling years. But according to my dad, Nate got greedy. He manipulated the contracts, forced my dad out into the cold, stole his shares, and used that foundation to build the massive empire he ruled today. My dad spent the rest of his life bouncing from one failed, desperate business venture to another, eventually drinking himself into an early grave, suffocated by the heavy blanket of unfairness. I didn't want an apology. I wanted $480 million. That was the exact number I had calculated. That was the current market value of the shares Nate had stolen from my father 30 years ago, adjusted for inflation, compound interest, and punitive damages. I wasn't planning to shoot him in an alley. I wasn't going to physically lay a finger on him. I was going to financially and publicly ruin him. My master plan was to confront him in a cornered environment, drop my mountain of evidence on his table, and force him to step down, transfer the funds, and surrender total control of the company. If he refused, I had compiled enough manipulated internal data to trigger a massive federal investigation that would freeze his assets and lock him in courtrooms for the rest of his natural life. I was living a terrifying double life. By day, I was his right-hand woman, the brilliant Izzy Vale, the young prodigy who helped him negotiate a massive warehouse acquisition in Texas. By night, I was Isabella Hale, the ghost of his past, obsessively piecing together a massive extortion package. IT was mentally exhausting. Sometimes late at night in the executive office, when it was just the two of us reviewing quarterly financial projections under the harsh fluorescent lights, he would look at me over the rim of his cheap glasses. He had this sharp, piercing gaze, like he was scanning my soul for structural weaknesses. I had to lock my jaw just to keep my hands from shaking. I had to constantly visualize my dad dying in that miserable hospital bed to keep my anger alive. I couldn't let his mentorship soften me. I couldn't let his bizarre, quiet moments of kindness confuse my mission. Like the time I stayed at the office until 3 a.m, fixing a massive supply chain error that wasn't even my fault. Nate had silently walked into my office, placed a hot cup of black coffee on my desk, and said, "You work too hard, Izzy. The work will always be here tomorrow. Don't forget to have a life outside of these walls." It was the most human, fatherly thing he had ever said to me. I hated him for it. I hated him for acting like a decent, caring man when I knew exactly what kind of monster he really was underneath the surface. I kept repeating my internal mantra. He is a thief. He is a liar. He destroyed my family, but maintaining a lie of that magnitude takes a heavy toll. The psychological pressure was building to a boiling point. Every single day, I walked through the heavy glass doors of the Seattle headquarters. I felt like a spy operating deep behind enemy lines. If he found out my real name, I was dead. Not literally, but he had the lawyers, the connections, and the raw power to crush my professional and personal life into dust before I could even scream. I had to be absolutely flawless. Y plan was finally entering its final stage. The Q2 financial dinner was approaching, and I had decided that was the precise moment I would pull the trigger. We were scheduled to meet at a high-end, fine dining restaurant in downtown Seattle. It was public enough that he couldn't cause a physical scene or call his security team, but private enough that I could lay out the blackmail without interference. I had the old company files. I had the documents. I had the weapon fully loaded. I genuinely thought I was the smartest person in the room. I thought I had played the perfect game, infiltrating the impenetrable fortress of the most paranoid CEO in the Pacific Northwest without him suspecting a single thing. I thought I was in total control of the narrative, holding all the winning cards in a game he didn't even know we were playing. But the most terrifying part about seeking revenge isn't the risk of failing. It's that gut-wrenching moment you realize you never actually understood the game you were playing in the first place. I thought I was the silent predator stalking him in the dark. I had absolutely no idea he had been waiting for me to strike. To get hired at Cross Meridian, you don't just submit a resume online and hope for the best. The company is a fortress. Nate Cross built his empire on paranoia and absolute control. His human resources department didn't just verify your employment history. They hired ex-military private investigators to dig through your digital trash, check your credit scores, and practically interview your childhood neighbors. I knew this because I had spent a full year studying their hiring protocols before I even dared to apply. Creating Isabella Vale wasn't just a matter of changing a name on a piece of paper. It was a full-scale fabrication of a human life. I bought a deceased infant's social security number through a dark web broker. I created fake academic records from a mid-tier university that had recently suffered a massive data breach, making it legally impossible for them to fully verify the physical records. I set up shell companies in Delaware to act as my previous employers, complete with working phone numbers that routed directly to prepaid burner phones sitting in my living room. I spent weeks memorizing my own fake history until I could recite it backwards while completely exhausted. I couldn't afford to lose control for a single second. When I finally walked into the Seattle headquarters for my final round of interviews, I felt completely detached from my own body. The building itself was intimidating, a massive structure of black glass and brushed steel that felt more like a military installation than a corporate office. The lobby was dead silent. No background music, no idle chatter. Just the sharp clicking of heels on polished marble and the quiet hum of the climate control. I was led up to the top floor, a restricted access zone that required a biometric scan just to exit the elevator. I wasn't meeting with a hiring manager anymore. I was meeting with him. Walking into Nate Cross's office was the most surreal moment of my life up to that point. I had spent years staring at blurry paparazzi photos and reading aggressive financial profiles of this man. I expected a tyrant pacing behind a massive mahogany desk, shouting into a phone. Instead, I found a tired-looking guy in a faded gray sweater, sitting at a perfectly clean, minimalist white table. He didn't look up when I walked in. He just kept reading a document through his cheap, smudged glasses. The silence stretched on for an agonizing 2 minutes. I didn't fidget. I didn't clear my throat. I just stood there, perfectly still, projecting the cold, calculating aura of Izzy Vale. Finally, he put the paper down and looked at me. His eyes were the color of wet concrete, and they locked onto mine with a terrifying intensity. He didn't ask me about my resume. He didn't ask about logistics or supply chain management. His first question was, "What is the worst thing you have ever done to get what you want?" I didn't blink. I gave him a fabricated story about ruthlessly dismantling a rival startup's supply chain to bankrupt them. A story I had rehearsed 100 times in my bathroom mirror. I watched his face closely. There was no moral judgment, no shock. Just a slow, almost imperceptible nod of approval. He recognized the predator in the story, and he wanted that predator working for him. He hired me right there in the room. The next 18 months were a blur of absolute obsession. I didn't just work across Meridian. I practically lived there. I was putting in 80, sometimes 90 hours a week. I had no friends. I had no social life. My entire existence was dedicated to climbing the corporate ladder fast enough to get into his inner circle before the cancer of my hatred ate me alive from the inside. I was brilliant at the job, and I made sure he noticed. In my 7th month, I identified a massive inefficiency in their Midwest trucking routes. I spent 3 sleepless nights building a new predictive algorithm that rerouted the fleet, saving the company $42 million in projected fuel and maintenance costs. I presented it to him in a tight, 5-minute meeting. He didn't say thank you. He just promoted me to director of strategy the very next week. That promotion was the key. It gave me the security clearance I needed to access the legacy servers. These were the highly restricted, heavily encrypted digital vaults where Nate stored the company's oldest records, including the foundational documents from the 1990s. Every night, after the rest of the executive floor had gone home, I would sit in my office with the blinds drawn, carefully bypassing the internal firewalls. It was slow, agonizing work. I could only download a few megabytes at a time to avoid triggering the automated security alerts. But slowly, piece by piece, I began assembling the puzzle of my father's ruin. I found the original incorporation documents for the Portland warehouse. I found the banking records from 1992 to 1997. I found the transfer deeds. Everything I needed to build my extortion package was right there, buried beneath 3 decades of corporate expansion. But as I gathered the weapons to destroy him, something deeply unsettling started happening. Nate began to trust me. The wall of ice he kept between himself and the rest of the world started to thaw. Just a fraction, but only for me. He started calling me into his office, just to bounce ideas off me. He would ask my opinion on massive, multi-million-dollar acquisitions. He invited me to high-stakes negotiations where I was the youngest person in the room by at least 20 years. He was actively grooming me, molding me into his successor. And the terrifying part was that he was an incredible mentor. He taught me how to read people, how to control a room without raising my voice, how to strip the emotion out of a decision and look purely at the mechanics of a problem. IT was psychological torture. I was spending my days learning from a master of industry, absorbing his brilliance, and then spending my nights plotting his total annihilation. There were moments when his bizarre, quiet kindness would completely disarm me. Once, I had a severe migraine during a board meeting, but tried to push through it. Nate noticed the slight wince I made when the projector screen flashed. He calmly paused the meeting, told the board we were taking a 10-minute recess, and handed me a bottle of water and 2 painkillers from his own pocket. He didn't make a big deal out of it, but the level of observation and care shook me to my core. I had to lock myself in a bathroom stall, pull out my phone, and look at a picture of my dad's headstone just to remind myself why I was there. I had to actively force myself to hate him. I couldn't let him be human. He had to remain the monster who stole my family's future. As the 18-month mark approached, the pressure inside my head was like a physical weight crushing my skull. I wasn't sleeping. I was barely eating. I was running entirely on black coffee and pure, concentrated adrenaline. The extortion package was finally complete. I had calculated the exact number, $480 million. I had the files loaded onto a secure, encrypted flash drive. I had printed copies of the most damning documents. I had drafted the resignation letter he was going to sign. All I needed was the right moment to strike. I chose the Q2 financial dinner. It was a quarterly tradition for the senior executives. But this time it was just going to be the 2 of us. We were scheduled to meet at a highly exclusive fine dining restaurant in downtown Seattle. The venue was perfect. The tables were spaced far enough apart for total privacy, but the environment was public enough to guarantee my physical safety. If he snapped, if he tried to call his security team, he would be doing it in front of the city's elite. I had mapped out every single possible reaction he could have and prepared a countermeasure for each one. I was holding all the cards. I had the element of surprise. I was the architect of his destruction, at least. That's what I kept telling myself as I got dressed that evening. I wore a sharp, dark suit, dressing more for a funeral than a dinner. I packed the files into my leather briefcase. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lock the clasp. I walked out of my apartment, got into my car, and drove toward the city center. Every red light felt like an eternity. Every mile brought me closer to fulfilling the promise I made in that bleach-smelling hospital room 5 years ago that I arrived at the restaurant exactly 10 minutes early. The maitre d' led me to a secluded booth in the back corner, dimly lit and perfectly isolated. Nate was already there. He was wearing the same faded gray sweater he always wore, completely out of place among the tailored suits and designer dresses filling the room. He was sipping a glass of ice water, looking perfectly calm, perfectly in control. I sat down across from him, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The leather briefcase was resting on the seat next to me, heavy with the truth. I took a slow, deep breath, ready to end his empire. I reached for the handle of my bag. But before my fingers even grazed the leather, Nate looked at me over the rim of his glasses, smiled a thin, knowing smile, and said something that made the room spin. "Before you open that briefcase, Isabella Hale, you should at least let me pour you a glass of water. You look like you're about to pass out." The name hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Isabella Hale. He didn't say Vale. He said Hale. For 3 seconds, the entire restaurant simply ceased to exist. The soft jazz playing through the hidden speakers, the clinking of crystal glasses, the low murmur of Seattle's elite. It all vanished into a high-pitched ringing in my ears. My hand, which was hovering inches above the leather handle of my briefcase, completely froze. My brain frantically scrambled to process what had just happened. Had I left a digital trail? Did the private investigators finally crack my Delaware shell companies? Did I slip up and use my real name in a meeting? I stared at him, expecting to see a triumphant sneer. I expected him to signal for the massive security guards he usually kept stationed outside the building. But he didn't do any of that. Nate Cross just sat there, looking at me with the exact same calm, tired expression he wore every single day. He picked up the heavy glass pitcher and slowly poured ice water into my glass. The ice cubes clinking loudly against the crystal. The silence was suffocating. I had spent 5 years preparing for this exact moment. I had mapped out a massive decision tree of every single possible reaction he could have. I was prepared for him to yell. I was prepared for him to threaten me. I was prepared for him to call his legal team right there at the table. But I was not prepared for him to already know my real identity and offer me a glass of water. The instinct to run was overwhelming. Every muscle in my body was screaming at me to grab my bag, walk out the front door, and disappear into the night before he could destroy me. But then I thought about that hospital room in 2019. I remembered the heavy, hollow look in my father's eyes as he choked on his own blood. I remembered the promise. I forced my hand to stop shaking. I grabbed the cold brass clasps of my briefcase and snapped them open. The sound was as loud as a gunshot in the quiet booth. "So you know who I am," I said, my voice dropping an octave, losing the polished, corporate warmth of Izzy Vale and replacing it with the cold, raw anger of Isabella Hale. That just saves us the introductory phase. It doesn't change anything about what is happening tonight. I pulled out the thick stack of documents and slammed them onto the white linen tablecloth. The papers spilled out, forming a messy collage of his past. The 1992 incorporation documents from the Portland warehouse, the banking records, the manipulated transfer deeds. I pointed a trembling finger at the center of the pile. "You destroyed my family," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but vibrating with a decade of suppressed rage. "You took a man who built a business with you from the ground up, a man who called you his brother, and you threw him out into the cold. You stole his shares. You stole his future. You built this massive, multi-billion-dollar empire on the foundation of his sweat and his blood. And you left him with absolutely nothing. He died with nothing, Nate. Because of you." Nate didn't look at the documents. He just looked at me. His eyes were entirely unreadable. "Is that what Victor told you?" he asked quietly. "Don't you dare say his name," I snapped, leaning across the table, no longer caring if the couple in the next booth was staring at us. "I am not here to listen to your excuses. I am not here to negotiate a severance package. I have spent the last 18 months buried inside your legacy servers. I know exactly how you operate. I know about the offshore accounts. I know about the regulatory loopholes you exploit in the Midwest. And I know exactly how to trigger a federal investigation that will freeze your assets by tomorrow morning." I reached into the briefcase one last time and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a formal letter of resignation and a transfer of equity. $480 million, I said, sliding the paper toward him. "That is the exact inflation-adjusted market value of the 50% stake you stole from my father in 1997. You are going to sign this paper. You are going to step down as the CEO of Cross Meridian Group. You are going to transfer those funds into a trust one have established, and you are going to walk away. If you refuse, or if you try to call your lawyers, I press one button on my phone, and the internal data I've compiled gets sent to the SEC, the FBI, and the Wall Street Journal simultaneously. Your stock will plummet before the market even opens, and you will spend the rest of your miserable life fighting federal indictments. I leaned back in my chair, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The trap was sprung. The weapon was fired. There was no going back now. I had him backed into a corner with zero leverage. I had finally won. Nate slowly reached out and picked up the resignation letter. He adjusted his cheap reading glasses and scanned the document. He didn't look panicked. He didn't look angry. If anything, he looked incredibly, profoundly sad. "You did incredible work, Isabella," he said, setting the paper back down on the table. "I mean that sincerely. The way you bypassed the legacy firewalls without triggering the internal audit alarms. It was brilliant. You are exactly the strategist I thought you were. You are smart, you are fearless, and you are fiercely loyal to the people you love. You would have made a spectacular CEO." The past tense caught me off guard. Would have. "Sign the paper, Nate," I said, my voice hardening, but he ignored the command. He took a slow sip of his ice water and folded his hands on the table. "You spent 18 months looking for evidence that I destroyed your father," he said softly. "You dug through 30 years of corporate history, looking for the exact moment I betrayed him. But you only looked for what you wanted to find, Isabella. You looked at the transfer deeds, but you didn't look at the external banking records. You looked at the final settlement, but you didn't look at why the settlement was drafted in the first place." "Stop talking," I warned him. "I know what you did." "No," Nate replied, his voice suddenly shifting from gentle to a hard, commanding tone that anchored me to my seat. "You know what Victor told you. You know the story a broken, desperate man told his daughter to explain why his life fell apart. But you do not know the truth." He reached down beside his chair. For a split second, sheer panic spiked in my chest. Was he grabbing a weapon? Was he pressing a panic button? But he wasn't. He lifted a battered, brown leather messenger bag onto his lap. He unbuckled it and pulled out a thick, tightly bound manila envelope. It looked ancient. The edges were frayed, and the paper was yellowing. He placed it on the table, right next to my meticulously organized extortion package. "I knew who you were the day you walked into my office for the final interview," Nate said, looking me dead in the eye. "My private investigators flagged your fake social security number 3 days after you submitted your resume. I knew you were Victor Hale's daughter. I knew you were coming for me, and I let you in anyway." The breath completely left my lungs. The entire foundation of my reality felt like it was crumbling beneath my feet. He knew. For 18 months, he knew. Why? I managed to choke out. "Because I owed it to you to let you see the truth for yourself," he said, sliding the heavy manila envelope across the table until it touched my hand. "Your father didn't lose his shares because I got greedy, Isabella. I didn't push him out into the cold. I spent 5 years trying to save him from himself." He tapped the top of the envelope. "You wanted to destroy my life tonight. Before you do, open that envelope. Look at the bank statements from 1996. Look at the hidden accounts he set up behind my back. Read the sworn testimony from our old accountant, Arthur Vance. He's 73 now, but he remembers every single detail." My hand was shaking violently now. I didn't want to touch the envelope. It felt radioactive. It felt like a bomb that was going to destroy the only thing I had left. The memory of my father. "Look at the papers, Isabella," Nate whispered, his voice heavy with 30 years of buried grief. "And see who really destroyed your family." I hesitated for a fraction of a second, terrified of what I might find. And then I opened the clasp. My fingers felt numb as I untwisted the small red string sealing the heavy manila envelope. The paper was dry and rough, smelling faintly of dust and old storage units. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct I had, every survival mechanism I had built over the last 28 years, was screaming at me to push the envelope back across the table, grab my briefcase and run. But I couldn't move. Nate just sat there, watching me with a quiet, devastating patience. I reached inside and pulled out the first stack of papers. They weren't legal threats or corporate jargon. They were raw, objective numbers. I was looking at original bank statements from 1996. The logo of a regional bank that had gone out of business decades ago was printed clearly at the top. I scanned the columns of numbers, my mind automatically shifting into the analytical mode that had made me so successful at Cross Meridian. I traced the money. Huge sums of capital were being drained from the Portland warehouse's primary operational account on a weekly basis. I flipped the page, looking for the destination routing numbers. The money wasn't going to vendors. It wasn't going to payroll. It was being funneled directly into an obscure LLC registered under a completely different address. And at the bottom of every single unauthorized withdrawal slip, there was a signature. It wasn't Nate's tight, precise handwriting. It was a messy, rushed scrawl that I recognized instantly. It was my father's signature. "What is this?" I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Nate took a sip of his water before answering. "Victor was bleeding us dry," he said, his voice stripped of any anger, leaving only a heavy exhaustion. While I was on the road trying to secure new transport routes, he was sitting in the office, secretly siphoning money from our client accounts and setting up a private manufacturing business behind my back. He was diverting our best clients to his own shadow company. I shook my head, my vision blurring. No, that's impossible. He told me you locked him out. He told me you manipulated the contracts. "Keep reading, Isabella," Nate instructed softly. I put down the bank statements and picked up a thick, stapled document. It was a sworn legal affidavit dated October 1997. The name at the top of the document was Arthur Vance. I recognized the name from the legacy servers. He was the original accountant for the Portland warehouse. According to the document, Arthur was the one who caught the discrepancies. The affidavit detailed, with agonizing chronological precision, exactly how Victor Hale had spent months cooking the books to hide his embezzlement. The testimony was bulletproof. There was no room for interpretation. Arthur, who is now 73 years old, had documented every single stolen dollar. "When Arthur brought me the real ledgers, I didn't confront your father immediately," Nate continued, the restaurant around us fading into absolute background noise. "I spent 8 grueling months secretly investigating him, gathering every single piece of evidence to understand exactly how deep the betrayal went. We were weeks away from total bankruptcy, Izzy. He was going to sink the ship and leave me holding the debt while he sailed away in a lifeboat bought with my money." I dropped the affidavit. My hands were shaking so violently that I had to press them flat against the table to stop the tremors. I reached for the final piece of paper in the envelope. It was the original transfer of equity from 1997. It was the exact same document I had based my entire revenge plot on, but now I was seeing it in its true context. "I gave him a choice," Nate said, leaning forward slightly. I laid the evidence on his desk. I told him he could either sign his shares over to me and walk away with a small severance to start over, or I would hand Arthur's file over to the district attorney and watch him face federal prosecution for embezzlement. I gave him the choice to leave or go to prison. He chose to disappear. The air was sucked out of my lungs. I couldn't breathe. The massive, immovable foundation of my entire life was violently ripped out from under me. Why father didn't lose his business because of a greedy partner. He wasn't a tragic victim of corporate theft. He was a thief. He had tried to ruin his best friend, got caught, and took the coward's way out. He spent the rest of his life bouncing from one failed venture to another because he didn't have Nate there to build the structure he needed. And instead of owning his failures, instead of taking responsibility for his own actions, he went home and lied to his daughter. He told me Nate Cross had stolen everything from our family. He planted a seed of toxic, consuming hatred in my head and let it grow for 28 years. He weaponized my love for him that I looked at the stack of documents I had brought in my briefcase. The meticulously organized extortion package. The demand for $480 million. The federal blackmail threat. It was all a complete joke. The money I thought I was owed was a phantom. I had spent 5 years of my life, isolated myself from the world, and destroyed my own mental health to avenge a crime that never actually happened. But the realization got so much worse. Panic, hot and suffocating, flooded my chest as I looked at Nate. I had spent the last 18 months actively plotting to destroy this man. I had infiltrated his company, lied to his face every single day, and stolen his private data. I was fully prepared to ruin his reputation, freeze his assets, and tear down the empire he had built from scratch. I was about to destroy a completely innocent man. Not just an innocent man, but the only person who had ever truly mentored me, the man who had recognized my talent, protected me, and trusted me implicitly. I was doing the exact same thing my father had done. I was betraying the only person who believed in me. Tears finally spilled over my eyelashes, hot and humiliating. I was completely disoriented, feeling like I was free-falling through an endless void. I had lived my entire life based on a lie, and in the process, I had become the exact monster I thought I was fighting. I shoved my own extortion documents away from me like they were soaked in poison. I couldn't look at them anymore. I looked up at Nate. He wasn't gloating. He didn't look triumphant or angry. He just looked at me with a profound, quiet empathy that absolutely shattered my heart. "You knew," I choked out, my voice cracking, barely recognizable as my own. "You said you knew who I was. Your investigators flagged me. I knew your real identity about 6 months after you started working for me," Nate confirmed calmly. Confirming the twist that had just broken my reality in half, I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles turning white. "Then why?" I pleaded, desperate to understand the mechanics of this nightmare. "If you knew I was Victor's daughter, if you knew I was digging into your legacy servers, if you knew I was planning to hurt you, why didn't you fire me? Why didn't you have me arrested for corporate espionage? Why did you promote me and bring me into your inner circle?" Nate took off his cheap, smudged reading glasses and set them on the table next to the evidence of my father's crimes. He looked at me, not as a CEO looking at an employee, but as an old man looking at a broken kid. "Because Isabella," Nate said, his voice dropping to a low, heavy whisper that sent a shockwave straight down my spine. "I needed to see if you were just a copy of your father, or if you were capable of being someone completely different." The words hung in the air between us, heavier than the physical evidence scattered across the white linen tablecloth. "I needed to see if you were just a copy of your father, or if you were capable of being someone completely different." I stared at Nate Cross, the man I had spent the entirety of my adult life demonizing. The restaurant around us continued its quiet hum of wealth and privilege, completely oblivious to the fact that my entire reality had just been atomized. For 28 years, I had been fueled by a highly concentrated, toxic narrative. My father had built a shrine to his own victimhood, and he made me the lead worshiper. He painted Nate as the ultimate villain, the greedy corporate monster who stole our future, and I swallowed that poison without ever asking a single question. I looked down at my own hands. They were shaking so violently I had to press them flat against my thighs under the table. I had spent the last 18 months lying to everyone, including myself. I had fabricated an entire identity, broken federal laws, and weaponized my own brilliance just to destroy a man who had actually tried to save my father from his own destructive greed. I had almost ruined an innocent man. Worse than that, I had almost ruined the only person in my professional life who had ever truly believed in me. "You took a massive risk," I finally managed to say, my voice sounding hollow and foreign in my own ears. "I had access to everything. I bypassed your legacy firewalls. I had the power to freeze your assets and trigger a federal investigation that would have paralyzed this company for years. If you knew who I was, if you knew I was Victor's daughter, why would you let me anywhere near your servers?" Nate leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He looked tired, older than his 61 years. "Because of the first month you worked for me, Isabella. I watched you. I saw the way your mind worked. You didn't just understand logistics. You understood the human element of the machinery. You built that predictive algorithm that saved us $42 million. And you did it because you genuinely cared about the efficiency of the system. I saw your brilliance, but I also saw the anger simmering just beneath your surface. He paused, looking at the faded manila envelope containing my father's crimes. Victor was brilliant too. People forget that. In the early days in Portland, back in 1992, he was a genius at networking. But he let his greed eclipse his talent. He wanted a shortcut. When my investigators flagged your fake social security number, my board of directors told me to have you arrested immediately. My legal team drafted the papers to hand you over to the authorities for corporate espionage. But I told them to wait. Why? I asked, the tears finally stopping, leaving only a dry, burning sensation in my eyes. Because you are not your father, Nate said quietly. Or, at least, I hoped you weren't. I wanted to give you the chance to see the inside of this company. I wanted to mentor you, to show you how a real business is run with integrity. I wanted to see if the environment of respect and trust would overwrite the hatred Victor planted in your head. I was gambling on your character, Isabella. I was waiting to see what you would do when you finally had the weapon in your hand. Would you pull the trigger blindly like he would have? Or would you pause and look for the truth? The shame that washed over me was suffocating. I hadn't paused. I hadn't looked for the truth. I had walked into this restaurant fully intending to pull the trigger. I had drafted the resignation letter. I had calculated the $480 million extortion fee based on a lie. If Nate hadn't brought the real banking records from 1996, I would have burned his life to the ground without a second thought. I looked at the meticulously organized extortion package sitting next to my water glass. It was a monument to my own blindness. Slowly, deliberately, I reached out and picked up the resignation letter I had demanded he sign. I didn't say a word. I just gripped the top edge of the heavy cardstock and tore it in half. Then I tore it again and again. I reduced the entire extortion package into tiny, meaningless pieces of confetti and let them fall onto the table. "I'm sorry," I whispered. It was the most inadequate phrase in the English language, but it was the only thing I had left. I spent my entire life hating you for something you never did. I became the exact monster I thought I was fighting. Nate watched me destroy the documents. He didn't smile, but the hard line of his jaw softened just a fraction. "You have a choice to make tonight, Isabella," he said, his voice shifting back to the authoritative tone of a CEO. "The lie is dead. The Izzy Vale persona is gone. The revenge plot is over. You are standing in the ashes of your own past. So, what do you do now?" I stared at him, completely lost. "What do you mean?" "I am not going to fire you," Nate stated plainly, dropping a bombshell that left my ears ringing. "I am not going to call the police. I am not going to destroy your career. But I am also not going to hold your hand. You can pack up your desk tomorrow morning, take your fake resume, and disappear into the wind just like your father did. You can walk away from this and try to start over somewhere else. Or you can stay." He leaned forward, locking his eyes onto mine. "You can stay here at Cross Meridian, under your real name, Isabella Hale. But if you stay, everything changes. The mentorship is over. The inner circle privileges are suspended. You'll have to rebuild the trust you shattered. And you will have to do it from the ground up. You will have to face the board of directors and admit who you are. You will have to prove to me and to yourself that you are a product of your own choices, not a victim of your father's lies." The restaurant around us seemed to hold its breath. I looked at the man sitting across from me. He wasn't giving me a free pass. He was giving me the hardest challenge of my life. He was asking me to step out of the comfortable armor of my hatred and stand naked in the truth. For 5 years, my entire identity was wrapped up in being the righteous avenger. If I let that go, who was I? Was I strong enough to just be Isabella, a woman who made a terrible mistake and had to spend years making up for it? I thought about my father's hospital bed. I thought about the bitter angry man who died with nothing because he refused to take responsibility for his own actions. He ran away when Nate confronted him. He chose the coward's path. I took a deep breath, feeling the cold Seattle air fill my lungs. The anger that had lived in my chest for a decade was gone, replaced by a terrifying, absolute clarity. "I'm staying," I said, my voice steady for the first time all evening. "I'm not running away. I will tell the board everything. I will rebuild the trust. I am not my father." Nate nodded slowly. He didn't look thrilled, but he looked satisfied. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a $100 bill, and tossed it onto the table to cover the untouched drinks. He grabbed his battered leather messenger bag and stood up. "Be in my office at 7 a.m. sharp, Isabella," he said, looking down at me with a cold, professional distance that completely severed the warmth we had shared over the last 18 months. "We have a lot of work to do." He turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving me sitting alone in the booth with the shredded pieces of my past. I had survived the collision. I had chosen my future over my history. But as I watched him disappear into the rainy Seattle night, a new, much colder reality set in. Getting the job under a fake name was easy. Planning the revenge was easy. Hating him was easy. But walking into that glass fortress tomorrow morning as the daughter of a thief, stripped of all my leverage and trying to rebuild a life from absolute zero, that was going to be pure, unadulterated hell. And the worst part was, I had absolutely no idea what he had planned for me next. Walking into the Cross Meridian building at 6:45 a.m. was the most agonizing physical experience of my life. Just 24 hours earlier, I had strutted through those heavy glass doors as the untouchable prodigy, the brilliant strategist who had the CEO's ear and a clear path to the top. Today, I felt like a dead woman walking. The biometric scanner at the private executive elevator flashed red when I pressed my thumb against it. Access denied. My stomach plummeted. I had to walk to the main reception desk and ask the security guard, a man I had personally authorized a bonus for last Christmas, for a temporary visitor badge. He looked at me with deep confusion, but he handed over the cheap plastic card that I took the slow, standard elevator up to the top floor. Nate's office was already unlocked. He was sitting at his pristine white desk, wearing the same faded gray sweater, reading a logistics report. He didn't look up when I walked in. He didn't offer me a cup of black coffee. The warm, quiet mentorship that had defined our relationship for the last 18 months had been completely eradicated, replaced by a suffocating, absolute zero coldness. "My security clearance is gone," I said, my voice sounding much smaller than I wanted it to. Nate finally looked up, his concrete gray eyes completely devoid of emotion. "You don't work for me anymore, Isabella. Not in the capacity you used to. Your access to the legacy servers, the financial projections, and the executive floor is permanently revoked. You are a massive security liability to this company. Put your visitor badge on. We're going to conference room A." Conference room A wasn't a standard meeting room. It was the bunker. It was a soundproof, heavily secured room deep in the center of the building, where the board of directors handled the most highly classified corporate crises. My heart started hammering against my ribs. I followed him down the long, silent hallway, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. When Nate pushed the heavy oak doors open, the air in the room instantly dropped 10 degrees. The core board of directors was already sitting around the massive mahogany table. There were 6 of them. These were not forgiving, empathetic people. They were the apex predators of the financial world. I recognized all of them, but the one who made my blood run cold was Marcus Vance, the chief legal counsel, and coincidentally, the son of the accountant who had caught my father stealing 30 years ago. Marcus was a notoriously ruthless corporate lawyer who treated the company's integrity like a religion. They all looked at me with mild curiosity, assuming I was there to present the Q3 predictive models. I stood at the end of the table, clutching my cheap plastic visitor badge. Nate didn't sit down. He stood at the head of the table and dropped the bomb without a single word of preface. "Ladies and gentlemen," Nate said, his voice cutting through the quiet room like a scalpel. I need to correct a massive security failure. The woman standing in front of you is not Isabella Vale. Her real name is Isabella Hale. She is the biological daughter of Victor Hale. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The mild curiosity shattered into absolute chaos. Marcus stood up so fast his heavy leather chair slammed into the wall behind him. The CFO, a highly paranoid woman named Sarah, physically recoiled from the table. 3 different people started yelling at Nate simultaneously. I just stood there, completely paralyzed, absorbing the raw, unfiltered hostility of 6 billionaires who had just realized a fox had been sleeping in the hen house for 18 months. "Are you out of your mind, Nate?" Marcus shouted, his face turning an angry shade of purple. He slammed his fist onto the table. "Victor Hale's kid? In the strategy department? I drafted the arrest warrants for her fake social security number a year ago. You told me it was handled. You told me it was a false alarm. She has access to our deepest financial infrastructure." "She had access," Nate corrected calmly, not raising his voice. "Her clearance was wiped at midnight. But she is here now, and we are going to deal with her." Marcus turned his venom toward me. If looks could cause physical damage, I would have been cut in half. "You are going to federal prison," he said to me, his voice shaking with rage. "I am calling the authorities right now. You committed corporate espionage, wire fraud, and identity theft. I will personally make sure you are buried under so many federal indictments you won't see the outside of a cell until you are 60. He reached for the phone in the center of the table. This was it. This was the moment I had to stop being the victim. I had to stop hiding behind my father's ghost. "Don't touch the phone, Marcus," I said, and my voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to make him freeze. I stepped forward, placing my hands flat on the mahogany table, forcing myself to look every single one of them directly in the eyes. I was terrified, but I let the cold, calculating strategist take the wheel. "If you call the authorities, the ensuing federal investigation will trigger a mandatory SEC audit of the entire cross-meridian network," I said, speaking rapidly and clearly. "They will seize the legacy servers. The stock price will plummet by at least 12% the moment the Wall Street Journal gets a hold of the story. You will lose billions in market cap over a revenge plot that never actually materialized. Yes, I lied to get in here. Yes, I bypassed your firewalls. But I didn't steal a single dime, and I didn't leak a single document to the press. You breached our servers." Sarah yelled, "You are a thief, just like your father." The comparison felt like a knife to the chest, but I didn't flinch. "I am not my father," I fired back. "I was fed a lie for 28 years by a man who couldn't take responsibility for his own failures. I came here to destroy Nate because I thought he destroyed my family. I was wrong. I admit that. I own my actions. But let's look at the actual math of my presence here. In the last 18 months, my algorithms have saved this company $42 million. My strategy on the Texas acquisition secured a monopoly on the southern transport routes. I am a liability, yes, but I am also the most profitable asset in this room." The room fell dead silent. They hated me, but they couldn't argue with the numbers. I had made them incredibly rich over the last year. Marcus glared at me, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. "So what do you want?" Marcus spat. "A medal? You want us to just let you walk away?" "No," I said, looking directly at Nate. "I want to stay, under my real name. I want to work off the debt of my betrayal." Nate finally stepped in. "She stays," he commanded, silencing the immediate protests from the board. "But she doesn't stay in the penthouse. She doesn't get the title, the salary, or the clearance. We have a massive hemorrhage in our Chicago logistics hub. The local management is entirely corrupt. The unions are 3 weeks away from a catastrophic strike, and the facility is losing $2 million a month. It is a dead zone. We were going to liquidate it." Nate looked at me, his eyes completely merciless. "You are flying to Chicago tonight, Isabella. You will take over as the floor manager of that hub. You will have no executive authority, no corporate budget, and no access to my team. You will fix the supply chain, stop the strike, and make the hub profitable in 90 days. If you succeed, you earn your place in this company as Isabella Hale. If you fail, or if you try to run, Marcus will file the espionage charges and destroy your life." It was a suicide mission. The Chicago hub was notoriously violent and broken. Sending a 28-year-old corporate strategist to manage hostile warehouse workers without any executive backing was designed to break me. Nate wasn't just testing my loyalty, he was punishing me. He was throwing me into the exact same muddy, desperate environment my father had failed in 30 years ago. "I accept," I said without a second of hesitation. The board dismissed me like a piece of garbage. I walked out of the bunker, my entire body trembling from the adrenaline crash. I had survived the execution, but I was being exiled to a corporate wasteland. I went back to my beautiful, pristine corner office to pack up my personal belongings. I grabbed my favorite pen, a few notebooks, and reached for the leather briefcase I had brought to the restaurant the night before. But as I opened the briefcase to slide my laptop inside, my blood ran completely cold. Laying right on top of my keyboard was a perfectly folded, unmarked, white envelope. It hadn't been there when I left my apartment this morning. Someone had been in my office while I was in the bunker. With shaking fingers, I tore the envelope open. There was a single, typed sentence on the paper. "Nate didn't give your father a choice in 1997. Isabella. Ask him what really happened to the money." I stared at the paper, the walls of the office seemingly closing in on me. I thought the lie was dead. I thought I had finally found the bottom of the truth. But as I read those words over and over again, a terrifying realization washed over me. The game wasn't over. It was just changing players. And someone else in this impenetrable fortress was watching my every single move. The flight from Seattle to Chicago was 4 hours of pure, uninterrupted psychological torture. I sat in a cramped economy seat near the back of the plane, listening to the heavy drone of the engines, staring blindly out the scratched plastic window into the pitch-black night. I wasn't thinking about the board of directors. I wasn't thinking about Marcus Vance threatening to bury me in federal indictments, or Nate Cross stripping away my entire life's work and exiling me to a failing warehouse. I was completely consumed by the single, typed sentence on the piece of paper folded in my jacket pocket. "Nate didn't give your father a choice in 1997. Isabella. Ask him what really happened to the money." That I had read those 19 words until they lost all meaning, and then I read them 100 times more. I thought I had hit rock bottom at the restaurant. I thought the revelation of my father's embezzlement was the absolute worst truth I could possibly face. But this note was a completely different kind of terrifying. It meant that someone inside that heavily fortified, biometric-locked boardroom knew exactly who I was. It meant someone had been watching me while I thought I was the one doing the watching. And most importantly, it meant the neat, tragic story Nate had handed me about my father's cowardice might be missing a massive, ugly chapter. But I didn't have the luxury of time to investigate ghosts. When the plane touched down at O'Hare International Airport at 4 a.m, the freezing Chicago rain felt like a physical slap to the face. I didn't go to a hotel. I took a cab directly to the Cross Meridian Midwest Logistics Hub. Nothing could have prepared me for the sheer scale of the disaster I was walking into. The hub was a massive, 2 million square foot concrete monster sitting on the industrial edge of the city. It smelled intensely of diesel fuel, wet asphalt, and stale coffee. The noise was deafening. Hundreds of massive freight trucks were idling, air brakes hissing, while forklifts aggressively darted between towering racks of cargo. It was absolute chaos. There was no optimized algorithm here. There was no clean, minimalist corporate strategy. It was a brutal, mechanical war zone, and they were losing $2 million a month. I walked through the heavy steel doors of the main dispatch office, wearing a plain heavy coat and carrying my leather briefcase. The local floor manager, a massive, thick-necked guy named Thomas Keller, was sitting at a battered metal desk eating a fast food breakfast. He looked at me like I was a bad joke. He knew exactly why I was there, and he clearly didn't respect a single ounce of it. "So, the king finally sent one of his Seattle princesses down to the mud," Keller said, not bothering to stand up. He took a slow bite of his sandwich, his eyes scanning me with open contempt. "I got the email from corporate an hour ago. Said you're the new floor supervisor. Said you have no budget, no firing authority, and no direct line to the penthouse. Basically, they sent you here to die, sweetheart." I didn't blink. I walked right up to his desk, placed my briefcase down, and looked him dead in the eye. "I am here to stop a strike and plug a $2 million monthly hemorrhage, Keller, and I have 90 days to do it. Where is my office?" He laughed, a harsh, scraping sound. He pointed a thick finger toward a tiny, glass-walled room in the back corner of the warehouse floor. It wasn't an office. It was a glorified broom closet situated right next to the loudest loading bay in the building. "Enjoy the view," he said, "and stay out of my way. The union boys are already breathing down my neck. The last thing I need is a corporate spy making them nervous before they walk out on us." I took the closet. I didn't complain. I sat down at the wobbly, stained desk, opened my briefcase, and pulled out my laptop. But I couldn't log in. My biometric clearance was permanently wiped. I couldn't access the advanced predictive models I had built. I couldn't run automated audits on their vendor accounts. I was completely cut off from the digital nervous system of Cross Meridian. If I was going to find out where the money was bleeding out, I had to do it entirely by hand. I spent the next 3 days living in a state of absolute, grinding exhaustion. I didn't sleep. I survived on vending machine coffee and sheer, stubborn willpower. I forced Keller's reluctant administrative staff to bring me the physical, printed copies of every single bill of lading, fuel receipt, and payroll ledger for the last 12 months. My tiny office became a suffocating mountain of paper. I was using a cheap plastic calculator and a red pen, doing the exact same grueling manual accounting that my father's partner, Arthur Vance, had done 30 years ago to catch him. It didn't take long for my brain to start seeing the patterns. You don't lose $2 million a month to simple incompetence. Incompetence is random. What I was looking at on the paper was highly structured. It was an orchestrated symphony of theft. There were ghost shifts being logged. Dozens of warehouse workers clocking in for overtime hours that didn't actually exist. There were massive fuel discrepancies where trucks were supposedly burning diesel at twice the normal rate, meaning someone was siphoning the fuel and selling it on the side. But the biggest hemorrhage was in the vendor contracts. The hub was outsourcing minor maintenance and supply runs to a series of local, third-party logistics companies. I traced the invoices. The companies were charging Cross Meridian quadruple the market rate for basic services, and Keller was signing off on every single one of them. He was robbing the company blind, and he was using the impending union strike as a smokescreen to hide the missing capital. If the workers walked out, the hub would shut down, the corporate auditors would blame the union for the financial collapse, and Keller would walk away rich. It was a brilliant, dirty little operation that on my 4th night in Chicago, the warehouse was unusually quiet. The midnight shift was running on a skeleton crew. I was sitting on the floor of my office, surrounded by stacks of vendor invoices, rubbing my burning eyes. I picked up a file for a company called Apex Industrial Solutions. They were supposedly providing heavy machinery repair for our forklifts. I looked at the billing address. It was a P.O. box. I looked at the routing number for the bank transfers, and my heart suddenly stopped beating. The blood drained completely from my face, and the ambient noise of the warehouse faded into a high-pitched ringing in my ears. I knew numbers. I had a photographic memory for financial data. I had spent 18 months obsessively staring at the evidence of my father's crimes inside Nate's legacy servers. I had memorized the exact banking details of the shadow company my father had set up to steal from Nate in 1996. I grabbed my red pen and rapidly wrote down the routing number from the Apex Industrial Solutions invoice on a blank piece of paper. Then, from pure memory, I wrote down the routing number for my father's 1996 unauthorized withdrawal slips. I stared at the two numbers side by side. They were exactly the same. IT was statistically impossible. The regional bank my father had used in Portland 3 decades ago didn't even exist anymore. But the shadow account was still active. The exact same financial black hole that had swallowed my father's career in 1996 was currently swallowing $2 million a month in Chicago in 2024. Keller wasn't just a corrupt local manager skimming off the top. He was funneling the money directly into the exact same ghost account my father had used. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing with terrifying implications. Did my father fake his own ruin? Was he still involved in this before he died? Or was Nate lying to me about what he actually found in those ledgers 30 years ago? I reached for the typed note sitting on my desk. Ask him what really happened to the money. Before I could even process the thought, the heavy glass door of my office suddenly clicked locked from the outside. I spun around. Standing on the other side of the glass, holding the keys, was Thomas Keller. He wasn't smiling anymore. He looked down at the physical ledgers scattered all over my floor, and then he looked directly at me. He reached into his heavy jacket, pulled out a thick steel wrench, and tapped it slowly against the glass. I was completely trapped, alone on the midnight shift, holding the one piece of evidence that could bring the entire empire crashing down. Keller didn't smash the glass immediately. He wanted me to feel the terror. He stood there in the dim, flickering light of the warehouse floor, slowly tapping the heavy steel wrench against the glass door of my tiny office. Tap, tap, tap. The sound echoed over the low hum of the idling freight trucks outside. He was smiling, a cold, dead expression that told me he had done this kind of thing before. He wasn't just a corrupt floor manager. He was the violent muscle protecting a massive financial hemorrhage that I was completely trapped. There was no back door. My phone had zero signal inside the concrete walls of the warehouse. But as I looked at Keller, then down at the piece of paper in my hand with the matching routing numbers, the paralyzing fear suddenly evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, hyper-focused clarity. I wasn't the grieving 23-year-old girl in the hospital room anymore. I was Isabella Hale, and I knew exactly how the math worked. I grabbed my laptop, walked right up to the glass door so I was inches away from his face, and hit the speaker button on my phone, pretending I had an active recording app running. If you break this glass, Thomas, you're going to spend the rest of your life in federal prison, I shouted, my voice cutting through the glass, completely steady. I don't care how big that wrench is. You aren't smart enough to set up a ghost account from 1996. You are a pawn. You are skimming pennies while someone in Seattle is taking the millions. And if you touch me, I press one button, and the FBI gets the exact routing numbers of the offshore accounts you've been feeding. Keller stopped tapping. His smile faltered just a fraction. He looked at my phone, then back at me. I could see the gears turning in his thick head. He was doing the risk assessment. You don't know anything, sweetheart, he sneered through the glass, but his grip on the wrench loosened slightly. You're just a fired corporate spy. I know the money is going into an account created by my dead father. I fired back, pushing my advantage. I know whoever you report to is using Victor Hale's old digital infrastructure to steal $2 million a month. And I know the man pulling your strings is Marcus Vance. It was a blind guess, a desperate leap of logic based on the typed note I had found in my office. But the moment the name left my mouth, all the color drained from Keller's face. He actually took a step back from the door. I had hit the bullseye. Before Keller could raise the wrench again, a blinding white light suddenly flooded the entire warehouse floor. The massive rolling doors at the far end of the loading bay violently shrieked open. 4 black SUVs roared into the building, their tires screeching against the polished concrete. A dozen men in dark tactical gear poured out of the vehicles, but they weren't local police. They were Cross Meridian's private corporate security, the absolute highest tier of Nate's personal guard, and stepping out of the lead vehicle, wearing his faded gray sweater and a heavy black overcoat, was Nate Cross. He didn't yell. He didn't run. He just walked across the warehouse floor with the terrifying, slow authority of a man who owned everything the light touched. Keller dropped the wrench immediately. He didn't even try to fight. Two security contractors slammed him against the steel racks and clamped heavy zip ties onto his wrists before I could even take a breath. Nate walked up to my tiny office. He took a key from his pocket, unlocked the glass door, and pulled it open. He looked at the mountain of physical ledgers scattered across the floor. Then he looked at the piece of paper in my hand with the matching routing numbers. "I see you found the ghost," Nate said quietly, and my hands were shaking so badly I had to put the paper down on the desk. "You knew," I whispered, the sheer magnitude of the manipulation crashing down on me. "You didn't send me here to punish me. You sent me here as bait." Nate didn't deny it. He stepped into the tiny office and closed the door behind him, giving us absolute privacy. "Marcus Vance's father, Arthur, didn't just catch your dad stealing in 1997. Isabella," Nate explained, his voice heavy with the weight of a 30-year secret. "Arthur realized how perfectly your father had hidden the money. When I forced Victor out of the company, Arthur kept the ghost account open. He passed the architecture down to his son. Marcus has been secretly bleeding Cross Meridian for 2 decades, using your father's digital footprint as the ultimate bulletproof cover. Every time an internal audit got close, Marcus would just bury the trail under Victor Hale's name." I stared at him, my mind spinning violently. But why did Marcus let me into the company? If he knew I was Victor's daughter, why not have me arrested the day I applied? "Because you were the perfect fall guy," Nate said, looking me dead in the eye. "Marcus knew you were coming for revenge. He let you bypass the firewalls. He wanted you to steal the internal data. His plan was to let you trigger your extortion plot, and then he would alert the authorities. When the FBI investigated you, they would find that all the stolen millions from Chicago were being funneled into an account in your family's name. You wouldn't just go down for corporate espionage, Isabella. You would go down for a 20-year embezzlement scheme. He was going to let you take the fall for his entire criminal empire." The typed note in my briefcase suddenly made terrifying sense. Ask him what really happened to the money. Marcus had left that note on my keyboard. He wanted me to panic. He wanted me to dig into the Chicago accounts, find my father's routing number, and try to run away with the evidence, proving my guilt to the authorities. "Then why are you here?" I asked, my voice cracking. If the board wanted me dead and Marcus was setting me up, why did you fly out here in the middle of the night? "Because I needed proof," Nate said softly. "I have suspected Marcus for years, but he is the chief legal counsel. He controls the audits. I couldn't touch him legally. I needed someone brilliant enough to manually trace the paper trail outside of his digital surveillance. And I needed someone who recognized Victor's specific financial signature. I threw you to the wolves, Isabella. I pushed you as hard as I could, stripped you of your power, and isolated you to see if you would run like your father did, or if you would stand your ground and fight for the truth." He reached out and picked up the piece of paper with the matching routing numbers. "And you fought. You just handed me the exact piece of evidence I need to destroy Marcus Vance." A profound, exhausted silence filled the tiny glass office. The sirens of the actual Chicago police were finally wailing in the distance, coming to arrest Keller, and, soon, Marcus Vance back in Seattle. The war was over. The 30-year cycle of theft, lies, and hatred had finally been broken by a cheap red pen and a mountain of printed paper. Nate looked at me, the cold, CEO mask finally dropping, revealing the mentor I had come to respect over the last 18 months. "You asked me in Seattle what you were supposed to do next," he said. "I am offering you a choice, Isabella. You can take this evidence to the FBI yourself. You can clear your father's name of the embezzlement Marcus pinned on him post 1997. You can walk away from Cross Meridian a hero, take a massive severance package, and never look back. He paused, looking out at the chaotic warehouse floor. Or you can fly back to Seattle with me. You can walk into the boardroom tomorrow morning, hand the FBI agents the arrest warrant for Marcus Vance yourself, and take his empty seat at the table. Not as Izzy Vale, not as my mentee, but as my partner. I stood there in the freezing, diesel-scented air of the Chicago logistics hub. I thought about the bitter, heavy promise I had made to a dying man in a hospital room 5 years ago. I had promised to make Nate Cross pay. But as I looked at the man standing in front of me, I realized the promise was built on a foundation of ghosts. My father had made his own choices. Marcus Vance had made his. It was time for me to make mine. I didn't want to be the righteous avenger anymore. I didn't want to be the victim of a generational misunderstanding. I wanted to build something real. I wanted to be the architect of my own future. I picked up my leather briefcase, snapped the brass clasp shut, and looked at Nate. The anger that had burned inside my chest for 28 years was completely gone, leaving only a sharp, unbreakable steel spine in its place. "I'll need a new security badge," I said calmly, "and a corner office with a better view." Nate Cross finally smiled. It was a small, genuine smile that didn't reach his eyes very often, but when it did, it meant everything. "Let's go home, Isabella." We walked out of the glass closet together, stepping onto the massive concrete floor of the warehouse just as the morning sun began to bleed through the high industrial windows. The shadows were finally disappearing. I wasn't just surviving the game anymore. I was ready to run the empire.